Outside a lonely cabin in the Wyoming winter, a dying cowboy collapsed at the door of a poor widow and her two children. She had nothing left to give, no money, no food, no hope, yet she chose to save him anyway. What she didn't know was that this man, Jace Callahan, carried a secret that would not only change her family's fate, but the destiny of an entire valley. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. And hey, I hope you're having a beautiful day. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next story that just might touch your heart. The year was 1877, and winter had not come kindly to Wyoming. It was the sort of season that ground every soul down to the marrow, when the sky itself seemed carved from gray iron and the wind poured across the plains like the breath of some vengeful god. Snow clung to the pines on the ridges above Sagebrush Hollow and lay heavy upon the roofs of the scattered homesteads, burying fences, smothering trails, and breaking the backs of cattle too weak to push through drifts. It was a land that asked everything of its people, and for Clara Whitmore, widowed at 34, it demanded more than seemed humanly possible. Henry had been gone almost a year, taken by fever in a matter of 3 bitter days, leaving Clara with 2 children, an old cabin, and a herd that had dwindled from 12 head to 4. She still caught herself turning toward the empty chair by the hearth, as if expecting him to sit, to laugh, to shoulder the chores she could no longer manage. Instead, she shouldered them alone, and when her strength ran out, she leaned on her children far earlier than she wished. Lydia, 11, was quick and clever, hair the color of ripened wheat, her gray eyes already carrying the weight of decisions a child shouldn't have to make. Samuel, only 8, still tried to fill his father's boots, gathering firewood with frozen fingers, walking taller than his years allowed. His cheeks were red from the cold, his eyes bright with stubbornness, as though, if he pretended hard enough, the world would believe him grown. That evening, as the storm gathered, Clara moved about the cabin with tired precision. She fed the last of the parsnips into the stew pot, stretching it with water until it was more broth than meal, and urged the fire to life with wood damp from snow. Lydia sat at the table mending one of Samuel's shirts by lamplight, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Samuel knelt at the hearth, feeding twigs into the flames, glancing now and then at his mother with a kind of worship that made Clara's heart ache. She wrapped her shawl tighter across her narrow shoulders, listening to the storm outside deepen its assault. Then came the sound, dull, heavy, unmistakably human. A thud against the door, a scraping, then the collapse of weight. At first Clara thought the wind had torn loose a shutter, but then came a groan, low and ragged, the voice of a man straining against death itself. Her stomach clenched. In times like these, strangers could mean salvation or ruin. Henry had once taken in a wayfarer who repaid him with a stolen saddle and a vanished mare. Yet to leave a man to freeze, what would that teach her children? That Whitmores closed their door on the suffering? That fear outweighed mercy? "Stay back," she warned, lifting the latch. The door shuddered as wind clawed inside, flinging snow across the floor. On the threshold lay a man, half buried in white, his broad shoulders bent, his head bowed as though beaten by the storm. His coat was torn across the chest, and beneath it a crimson stain had frozen stiff into the fabric of his shirt. His hat had rolled into the snow, revealing dark hair plastered to his forehead with ice. "Dear Lord," Clara whispered. "Mama?" Samuel's voice was thin. "Is he dead?" "No," she said quickly, pressing fingers to the stranger's neck. A pulse thudded there, weak but insistent. She swallowed. Not yet. The man was impossibly heavy, solid muscle and bone, the kind of weight that would drag her down if she wasn't careful. Clara tried to hook her arms beneath his, straining as her boots slipped on the slick boards. "Lydia, help me with his shoulders. Samuel, pull that quilt, lay it out flat." They obeyed without hesitation. Together, with Clara pulling and Lydia pushing, they managed to lever him just over the threshold. Samuel, panting with effort, shoved the quilt beneath his body, and then, inch by inch, they dragged the stranger across the floor toward the hearth. Clara's back screamed, her arms quivered. But at last, he lay sprawled before the fire, the snow melting from his clothes into puddles on the floorboards. By the light of the flames, Clara saw him more clearly. He was perhaps in his late 30s, his face weathered by sun and trail dust, yet carved with a rugged strength that seemed carved from granite itself. His jaw was square, lined with stubble, his cheekbones high, his mouth drawn tight by pain. Even in collapse, his chest and arms showed the bulk of a man accustomed to labor, to saddles and rope and hard earth. But the bullet wound had undone that power. Blackened edges marked the shirt where powder had burned, and blood still seeped sluggishly from beneath the torn cloth. Lydia drew back with a sharp breath. "Mama, look, he's been shot. What if he's dangerous? What if someone's after him?" Her eyes were wide, not only with fear but with the sharp suspicion of a child learning the world could bite. Samuel, in contrast, knelt closer, awe written across his face. "He looks like the heroes from the dime stories," he whispered, "like he fought bandits." Clara's hands trembled, torn between their voices. Lydia's fear was reasonable. Men shot in the chest did not come from safe company. Yet Samuel's awe reminded her of Henry's kindness, of the night he had given shelter to a trapper half frozen on the trail. She had argued then, fearing theft, and Henry had said, "If we close our door to the lost, what kind of people are we?" He had died with that same generosity in his eyes. Clara could not betray it now. "Fetch my herb box," she said at last, "and a kettle of water. Hurry." The work was desperate and clumsy. Clara slit the shirt with her scissors, baring the wound. The skin around it was angry and raw, blood seeping with every shallow breath. She cleaned as best she could with hot water, her fingers raw from scrubbing. The smell of iron filled the air. She poured the last of the whiskey Henry had left over the wound, her heart tightening at the man's involuntary jerk and groan. Lydia pressed rags hard against his chest, while Clara layered comfrey leaves and yarrow, binding them with strips torn from an old sheet. At one point, the stranger's eyes flickered open. They were green, startling, threaded with gold, and they locked on hers with a clarity that pierced through the haze of pain. His lips moved, voice rough. "Thank you." Then the light faded, and his lids sank closed again. Samuel gasped softly. "Mama," he spoke. "He's alive for real." Clara forced herself to steady her hands. "He'll live if we keep him warm." She looked at the stew pot, nearly empty. Every instinct screamed to save what little they had for the children, but the boy's eyes were on her, trusting, waiting. She dipped a spoon into the broth, cooled it, and touched it to the stranger's lips. At first he only shivered, but then he swallowed, a few drops at a time, until she dared give him more. Not food enough to strengthen him, but enough to tether him to the living. When at last she sat back, sweat dampening her temples. Despite the chill, Clara realized her children were watching her as though she had performed some impossible magic. She reached out, drew them both close, and whispered, "We've done what we could. The rest is in God's hands." The storm howled against the cabin, rattling the shutters. Clara leaned into the rocking chair, cradling Samuel against her side, while Lydia hovered near the fire. The stranger breathed shallowly on the floor, his chest rising and falling beneath the bandages. For tonight, he belonged to them, and they to him. His fate had tangled with theirs, as unshakable as the wind outside. Beyond the walls, unseen in the blizzard's fury, a horse nickered faintly, stamping against the snow, and farther still, the distant echo of another sound flickered across the storm, a sharp report, like wood splitting, or perhaps a rifle carried on the wind. Clara froze, listening. Nothing followed but the roar of the gale. She tightened her hold on her children, eyes lingering on the man who had fallen into their lives, knowing that whatever hunted him out there might yet come to her door. The storm that had battered Sagebrush Hollow broke apart with the coming of dawn, leaving the valley shrouded in an uneasy stillness. Snow lay heavy on the ground, smoothing every shape into white curves, and the air was so sharp it stung the lungs with each breath. Inside the Whitmore cabin, the fire still glowed from the night's watch. The children stirred restlessly beneath their quilts, and the stranger, Jace Callahan, remained stretched out near the hearth. His breaths were shallow, his skin pale as bone, yet the fever that had gripped him in the dark hours seemed to ease as light seeped through the shutters. Clara Whitmore, who had slept hardly at all, watched with wary eyes, torn between hope and fear for the burden she had chosen to take in. When Jace stirred at last, It was not with the ease of a man roused from ordinary sleep, but with the slow struggle of someone dragging himself back from the edge. His hand twitched against the blanket, his jaw tightened, and then his eyes opened. They were green, flecked with gold, sharp even in weakness, and they darted quickly across the room before settling on Clara. He tried to rise, only to gasp as pain lanced through his chest. Clara pressed him firmly back with a steady hand. "Lie still. You've no strength to spare." His voice was a rasp, hoarse with thirst. "Where am I?" "In my cabin. Sagebrush Hollow." She kept her tone calm, though her heart raced. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing shallow. "I remember snow. Didn't think I'd make it off the ridge." His words carried the weight of truth, but not the whole of it, and Clara could feel the absence pressing against them. She had seen bullet wounds before, on Henry, years ago, when a neighbor's hunting rifle had misfired, and she knew a shot like this did not come from any accident. Lydia had been listening silently, standing near the table with her arms crossed, her expression guarded. At 11, she carried herself older than her years, her gray eyes sharpened by hardship. "Who shot you?" she demanded suddenly. Her voice was thin, but edged with suspicion, a child already learning that the world carried dangers. Jace's gaze flicked to her, then to Clara, and he said nothing. His silence spoke more than words. Samuel, in contrast, crept closer, curiosity overcoming fear. He was small for 8, with fair hair that stuck out in tufts, his cheeks flushed from the fire. "Maybe he's a cowboy," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Like in the stories. Maybe he fought bandits." Jace's mouth curved faintly, though pain shadowed the gesture. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice a ghost of a smile. The days that followed passed in fragments of sleep and slow recovery. At first, Jace could barely manage a sip of broth, his body racked with fever that left him sweating through the night. Clara sat through those hours with damp cloths and whispered prayers, her hands raw from changing bandages, her back aching from rising too often to stir the fire. In the darkest watches she nearly lost him, his breath shallow, his skin burning, but each time he clawed back as though refusing surrender. By the end of a week, he could speak in full sentences, though his voice was still rough. He began to notice the children, who hovered near with the wary curiosity of strays drawn to a campfire. Samuel brought him treasures from the snow, the feather of a crow, a stone shaped like an arrowhead, and Jace accepted them solemnly, as if each gift mattered. Lydia lingered at the edge, still watchful, still unconvinced. Yet when he asked her to read aloud from the battered primer Henry had once used with her, she obeyed. At first her voice shook with defiance, daring him to correct her. But when he praised her steadying rhythm, she flushed and returned the next evening with another page ready. Clara watched all this with a tightening in her chest. It unsettled her to see the way Samuel leaned into Jace's presence, or the way Lydia's suspicions softened, if only a little. She could not decide whether it was a blessing or a trap. Each time she met Jace's gaze across the room, she was reminded of the secrets in his silence. Outside, the weight of reality pressed harder. The food stores dwindled to almost nothing, and by the 10th day Clara had no choice but to saddle their aging bay mare and ride into the settlement. The trip was slow, the snow still deep, the air biting, and by the time she reached the cluster of buildings that passed for town, her fingers were numb. The church steeple rose plain and unpainted against the sky. The general store sagged beneath snow on its roof, and at the heart of it stood the bank. Clara felt dread settle in her stomach before she ever dismounted. Inside, the banker, Ezra Harland, looked as polished as ever, his dark suit pressed, his hair slicked back, his mustache trimmed neat. He was a man who thrived on control, and even in winter his boots shone. He greeted her with smooth courtesy that carried the sharp edge of warning. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, shuffling his papers with long fingers. 3 months is generous. The bank has obligations as well, and patience cannot be stretched without end. Clara stood tall, though her heart twisted. "I'll find a way," she said, her voice steady despite the hollowness beneath. Ezra's gaze lingered on her face, unreadable. Then he closed the folder. "See that you do." For your children's sake, his dismissal was as clear as the clap of a door. At the general store, Clara felt the weight of other eyes. Mrs. Colburn gave her a polite nod, but whispered behind her hand as soon as Clara passed. A pair of younger women fell silent altogether, their stares sliding over her with judgment. Clara knew the shape of their whispers already. The widow Whitmore, sheltering a man, a stranger, a gunshot wound. Rumor moved quicker than any stagecoach. She returned home with flour and salt, her back straight, but her spirit heavy. Lydia met her at the door, face pale. "Mama," she whispered, "people know." They're talking. Samuel burst in behind, proud of the bundle of sticks he had gathered, oblivious to the undercurrents tightening around them. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara sat by the fire, mending Henry's old coat, and found Jace watching her. He was propped against the wall now, strength beginning to return, though his skin was still pallid. For a moment neither spoke, only the crackle of the fire filling the silence. At last, she asked softly, "Will trouble follow you here?" His eyes met hers, steady, unreadable. "Trouble follows every man," he said, "but I'll not bring mine to your door, not if I can help it." The answer was not enough, yet it was all he would give. Clara felt the unease tighten in her, but also a strange flicker of trust she wished she did not feel. Sunday came, and with it church. Jace urged them to go without him, his voice rough but insistent. The congregation filled the plain wooden building, their voices rising in hymns, but Clara felt stares prickle her skin. Mrs. Talbot, silver-haired and kind-eyed, touched her arm after the service. "Don't let tongues wag you down, dear. You've always done right by your young ones. God sees yet, just beyond." Mrs. Harland, the banker's wife, watched with thin-lipped disapproval, her gaze a knife. That evening, when they returned, Clara lit the lamp and saw Jace seated with Samuel at his side, the boy leaning close as Jace whittled slowly at a piece of wood. Lydia stood near, pretending indifference, though she stole glances at the carving. For a moment, Clara's cabin felt less empty, warmed not only by fire, but by the presence of something fragile and unspoken. Still, the questions remained, heavy as the snow on the roof. Later, as Clara banked the fire for the night, a sound reached her ears, a faint rhythm of hooves on frozen ground, distant but unmistakable. She stiffened, listening hard, but the night fell silent again. Perhaps only her imagination, or perhaps a warning. Either way, she knew their fragile peace balanced on a knife's edge. The hoofbeats Clara thought she heard in the night faded into silence, yet the unease lingered like frost on the window panes. The days in Sagebrush Hollow carried on with the rhythm of winter, but something had shifted in the little cabin. Jace Callahan was no longer only a half-dead stranger laid before their fire. He was regaining his strength, slowly, stubbornly, and with each passing hour his presence wove itself more firmly into their lives. At first, his recovery was halting. He could walk only from the hearth to the doorway before pain bent him double, sweat breaking across his brow. Clara insisted he rest, but Jace's pride refused to leave him idle. He began with small tasks, splitting kindling seated on a stool, tightening loose hinges on the barn door, showing Samuel how to sand a warped board smooth. His voice was steady even when his hands shook, and he never once complained of pain, though Clara saw it etched into the lines around his mouth. Samuel adored him for it. The boy followed at his heels with wide eyes, carrying tools, fetching water, trying his best to mimic the calm precision of Jace's movements. Once, while balancing on a ladder to fix a warped beam, Samuel nearly slipped. Jace's arm shot out, iron strong even in weakness, steadying the child before he fell. The look Samuel gave him after that was not just admiration. It was devotion. That night, Jace whittled a small knife from a piece of soft wood, sanded its edge blunt, and handed it to Samuel. "Every man needs a tool of his own," he said. The boy slept with it under his pillow. Lydia was harder to win. She kept her distance, arms crossed, her eyes sharp with suspicion. When Jace asked her to hold a lantern in the barn while he guided Samuel through hammering a nail, she did it stiffly, lips pressed thin. But when Jace's boot slipped on the rickety ladder and he nearly fell, it was Lydia who caught the lantern steady, her quick reflexes preventing fire from spilling into the straw. Jace glanced at her then, green-gold eyes glinting in the lamplight. "You've steadier hands than half the cowboys I've ridden with," he said. Lydia flushed, muttered something under her breath, and stalked away. But that night, Clara noticed the girl sitting closer to the fire, pretending not to listen as Jace told Samuel a story. Clara herself was torn. Gratitude stirred in her heart when she saw the children's laughter return, when she watched Jace's strong hands repair what Henry had left unfinished. Yet fear coiled beside it. Each time she looked at the bandage across his chest, she saw again the powder-burned wound, the mark of a bullet fired at close range. Men with wounds like that were not pursued by chance. One evening, after Samuel had gone to bed, clutching his wooden knife, and Lydia pretended to sleep, though her eyes gleamed in the shadows, Clara set aside her mending and faced Jace directly. He sat near the fire, carving wood shavings into curls, the lamplight drawing harsh lines across his jaw. "You've done much for us," she began, her voice low, "but I can't ignore what brought you here. Whoever pulled that trigger didn't mean to miss. If danger is still hunting you, my children will pay the price." Jace's knife stilled. He looked into the fire for a long time before speaking. "You're right. It wasn't chance. There's a man, a cattle baron with more land than he can ride, more men than he can pay. He runs his empire with fear, and he doesn't forgive betrayal." Clara's hands clenched around the fabric in her lap. "And you betrayed him?" His eyes lifted to hers, steady, unflinching. "I spoke where others stayed silent. I saw how he stole land, crushed small ranchers. I told him to his face I wouldn't ride with him anymore. That was enough. Men like Colton Blackwood don't let words go unpunished." He set the carving down carefully, as if the motion itself carried weight. "He'll hunt me till one of us is in the ground." Clara's breath caught. Anger surged first, anger that he had brought such a storm to her doorstep. "And you thought to fall half dead at my door, dragging his shadow across my children?" Her voice shook with fury. Jace did not flinch. "I didn't think at all. I was bleeding out in the snow. Your kindness saved me. I owe you for that, and I won't run now. If Blackwood's men come, I'll face them before they ever reach you." His calmness disarmed her anger. She turned away, staring into the fire, torn between fear and a reluctant trust she did not want to feel. Meanwhile, the town had begun to talk. Clara's trip to the general store brought whispers that clung to her like burrs. She heard her name hissed between women as they weighed flour, saw glances cut sharp as knives. The banker's wife watched her with tight disapproval, and Mrs. Colburn's friendly nod had shriveled into silence. But there was kindness too. Mrs. Talbot, silver-haired and warm-eyed, pressed a loaf of bread into Clara's basket and whispered, "Don't listen to tongues. You've always done right." The words steadied her more than she cared to admit. The following Sunday, gossip filled the pews as much as hymns. Clara kept her head high, her children beside her, but she felt the weight of every stare. After service, Lydia muttered bitterly, "They think we're liars. They think you're wicked." Clara hushed her gently, but the sting was real. Back at the farm, Jace poured his strength into teaching. He showed Samuel how to read a horse's ears, how to stand still until the bay mare accepted his hand. He coached Lydia, untying knots that would hold against wind and rain. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart aching. Henry had promised to teach them these things, but death had stolen his chance. Now, a stranger carried on that promise, and the sight filled her with both gratitude and dread. One night, after the children were asleep, Jace sat sharpening his knife by the fire, the steady rasp of stone on steel filling the silence. Clara folded her hands, summoning the courage to ask, "If Blackwood is as ruthless as you say, what makes you think he'll stop? Even if you fight him, what becomes of us when the town turns against me?" Jace paused, then looked up, his eyes burning in the lamplight. "Whispers can't break what's built strong," he said quietly. "But storms—" His voice lowered, rough with certainty. "Storms are coming." Before Clara could reply, the distant sound of hooves drifted through the night air. Not the faint rhythm of a single horse wandering, but the steady tread of riders moving along the ridge. She froze, every muscle taut, listening. Jace's hand tightened on the knife, his body tensing despite the wound. The hoofbeats faded into silence, but the warning remained heavy in the air. The storm that had threatened in the distance finally came roaring down the valley, shaking the timbers of Sagebrush Hollow with a fury that seemed bent on tearing the little homestead from the earth. Snow piled against the doors and windows until the cabin groaned beneath its weight. The fire snapped and hissed as the wind forced its way through every crack in the walls, and outside, the barn cried out like a wounded beast, its roof sagging dangerously under the burden of white. Inside, Clara tried to keep the children calm, drawing Lydia close while Samuel shivered beneath the quilt, his eyes wide with fear. Jace stood near the window, his face pale but his shoulders squared, every line of him tense with decision. When the sound of cracking timber echoed from the barn, Clara's heart seized. The cattle bawled in panic, muffled by the storm, and Samuel cried out, "Mama, the cows!" Clara moved to rise, but Jace was already reaching for his coat, jaw set with grim resolve. She caught his arm, her voice sharp with both fear and command. "You're still hurt. You can't. If that roof falls, your stock dies, and without them you won't last another season," he said, his voice steady despite the pain she knew still gnawed at him. He met her gaze firmly. "Stay with the children. I'll manage." Before she could argue further, he was out the door, swallowed by the white roar of the storm. Clara clutched Lydia and Samuel close, whispering prayers, her eyes fixed on the faint glow of the lantern Jace carried across the yard. She watched him force the barn doors open, staggering against the gale, then disappear inside. The storm howled louder, as though trying to tear him from their sight entirely. Minutes dragged into an eternity before the doors burst open again. Through the swirling snow, Clara saw shapes moving, cattle driven out into the yard, their hides dusted with ice, their hooves stamping against the frozen ground. Jace shouted, his voice raw and ragged, herding them clear before vanishing back inside. When he returned, he carried a broken timber across his shoulder, slamming it into place as a brace. The barn shuddered but held. By the time he stumbled back toward the cabin, his lantern nearly spent, his coat torn and his bandage stained through, Clara was already at the door. She hauled him inside, her arms trembling with the effort, and pressed him into the chair by the fire. "You fool!" she whispered fiercely, wrapping a quilt around his shoulders as his lips trembled from the cold. His answering smile was weak but unyielding. "Better I break than your roof fall on the children." That night, while the storm clawed at the cabin, Jace sat hunched close to the fire, and for the first time, he spoke openly of the truth he had carried in silence. His voice was rough but steady. "There's a man named Colton Blackwood, a cattle baron with more money than mercy, more men than he can feed. He took land that wasn't his, crushed ranchers beneath him, bought lawmen to look the other way. I rode with him once, saw too much, spoke too much, and when I left, he swore I wouldn't live to tell another soul. That's the shadow that follows me." Clara's stomach clenched, her heart torn between rage and dread. She rose to her feet, her voice shaking with fury. "So you brought his vengeance into my home. You put my children beneath his noose." Jace did not look away. "I brought nothing but myself. I fell at your door because I had nowhere else left to stand. If his men come, they come for me, and I'll face them before I let harm touch your family." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and in that silence Clara felt her anger falter. He had risked his life to save her barn, had stood against the storm without thought for himself. Her voice softened, though her fear remained. "And if your fight swallows us anyway?" Jace's eyes, green with flecks of gold, held hers without wavering. "Then I'll carry that weight. Not you." 2 days later, when the storm had passed and the valley lay buried under drifts taller than a man, a rider came to the cabin. Sheriff Elias McGraw, his mustache bristling with frost, his wolf-lined coat dusted with snow, swung down from a tired bay gelding and knocked firmly on the door. Clara admitted him, her heart hammering, while Jace sat stiffly by the hearth, his knife set aside, but his eyes watchful. "Callahan," the sheriff said, his voice like gravel rolling in a pan. "Word travels quick in these parts. I heard you were laid up here." His gaze moved to Clara, heavy but not unkind. "And I heard Blackwood's men cross the river before the storm, 3 riders asking questions. That's not good news for any of us." Jace's jaw tightened. "I didn't choose to bleed on her doorstep." But I'll not bring trouble to her family if I can help it. McGraw pulled off his gloves slowly, his eyes sharp. I've dealt with Blackwood's kind before. He doesn't send men north unless he means to take something. If he knows you're here, he'll come hard, and he'll come fast. And if he suspects Mrs. Whitmore is sheltering you, she and her children will be dragged into the fire, whether she wills it or not. The sheriff's words cut through the room like a blade. Clara felt Lydia press against her side. Samuel's hand slip into hers, both children silent but trembling. She lifted her chin, though her throat was tight. "What are you telling me, Sheriff?" "I'm telling you," McGraw said, his eyes tired but earnest, "that you stand at a crossroads. You can send him away and hope Blackwood follows his trail out of here. Or you can keep him, knowing his fight will become yours. I can't make the choice for you, but it's a heavy one. And once you take it, there's no turning back." The cabin fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Jace's gaze never left. Clara's, neither pleading nor defiant, only steady, as if he accepted whatever judgment she would render. Samuel's eyes begged her not to let him go, while Lydia's grip on her hand trembled with fear. Clara's heart pounded, caught between duty and the fragile hope that had begun to grow in the warmth of Jace's presence. Then, from outside, a sound drifted through the still air, a faint barking of dogs carried on the wind, sharp and insistent, coming from somewhere beyond the ridge. Clara stiffened, her breath caught in her chest. Lydia turned her face upward, whispering, "Mama, they're close." The sheriff's hand went to his coat, where the gleam of his revolver lay hidden. He looked at Clara once more, his voice low but certain. "You don't have much time to decide." The night after the sheriff's visit carried a silence too sharp to be trusted, a silence broken only by the groan of timbers beneath the weight of snow and the distant howl of coyotes along the ridge. Clara had sat long after the children fell asleep, staring into the hearth flames as if they might hold answers, while Jace sat opposite her, knife laid aside, his eyes restless in the shadows. The weight of choice hung heavy between them, but dawn never came to grant reprieve. Instead, it was fire. Samuel woke first, coughing in his bed, nose wrinkling at the acrid scent that threaded through the cabin. Lydia's gasp followed, sharp and frightened, as an orange glow flared across the shutters. Clara shot to her feet, heart hammering. Jace was already at the door, hand on the latch, when the first shout carried over the wind. "This is Blackwood's warning!" a voice bellowed, cruel and mocking. "Send out Callahan, or we'll burn you all to ash." The barn roared with flames, its roof already licked by fire, sparks carried high into the winter night. Cattle bellowed within, terrified, their bodies thrashing against stalls. Clara pulled the children close, her breath caught in her throat, but Jace was gone in an instant, striding into the yard with grim resolve, the glow of fire painting his broad frame against the snow. 3 riders wheeled their horses at the edge of the hollow, bandanas over their faces, torches still smoldering in their hands. They lingered only long enough to make their threat, then vanished back into the dark, hoofbeats swallowed by the storm-laden wind. The barn, however, remained, flames rising like a beacon. Jace reached the well, seized the bucket, and turned toward the fire. Clara ran after him, dragging Samuel and Lydia into the yard despite the smoke burning her lungs. "You can't fight this alone," she cried, her voice nearly lost in the roar. Jace met her eyes, his face drawn but steady. "Then we won't." Help came not at once, but in pieces. Sheriff McGraw was the first, riding hard through the night after glimpsing the glow from his patrol on the ridge. He swung down from his gelding, rifle across his back, his eyes narrowing as he took in the blaze. "Damn them," he muttered, seizing a bucket without hesitation. Moments later, Henry Talbot, Jr., broad-shouldered and breathless from running the half-mile from his family's homestead, arrived with a yoke across his shoulders and 2 pails clanking at his sides. Old Mr. Peterson limped after, leaning on his cane, carrying a battered tin pail, though his back bent nearly double. More followed, drawn by firelight and loyalty, until a line formed, men and women alike, passing buckets hand to hand from the well to the barn. Jace did not storm headlong into the flames. His wound would not allow it, and Clara's furious warning still rang in his ears. Instead, he moved with sharp precision, commanding the effort, his voice steady through smoke and chaos. "Drive the cattle out first. Don't let them choke inside," he barked, shoving the barn doors wide. Henry Jr. dashed in with a wet cloth over his mouth, Clara close behind, pulling frightened beasts into the snow-choked yard. Samuel tried to follow, but Jace caught him by the collar, hauling him back with a fierce glare. "Not you, boy. Not this fight. Guard your sister." Samuel's lip trembled, but he obeyed, clutching Lydia's hand tight as she stood with the lantern, guiding neighbors toward the stalls without setting foot inside the inferno. The two children, kept to the edge, watched with wide eyes as the adults battled smoke and fire with frantic rhythm. The flames bit hard, greedy for every plank, but the people of Sagebrush Hollow fought harder. Buckets sloshed, steam rose in choking clouds, and voices called through the smoke as cattle burst free into the yard, their hides steaming, their hooves striking sparks on the frozen ground. Jace limped once into the barn, only long enough to seize a calf trapped in its stall, hauling it out against his chest before thrusting it into Clara's waiting arms. The effort tore his bandage, blood blooming dark beneath his shirt, but he gave no sound, his jaw clamped like iron. By dawn, the barn stood blackened but not broken. Its timbers smoldered, its roof charred, yet it remained upright. The cattle gathered shivering in the yard, the snow churned to mud beneath stamping hooves. Exhaustion hung over every face, ash-streaking skin, clothes stiff with smoke, but in their eyes glimmered a hard-earned pride. Sheriff McGraw leaned against his rifle, sweat streaking down his brow despite the cold, and looked across the yard. "Blackwood sent his dogs to scare us," he said, his voice rough but strong. "He thought fire would break us. But we put it out together. That's how we beat him, by standing as one." A murmur of agreement rose among the neighbors. Some voices carried warmth, like Mrs. Talbot's fierce declaration. "The Whitmores are one of us, and so is Callahan." Others were less certain, murmurs edged with doubt, glances sliding toward Jace with wariness. But no one could deny what they had seen. The drifter had fought through smoke and flame to save a widow's farm, had bled in their defense. Clara stood with her children pressed close, her body shaking with weariness and relief. When Samuel whispered hoarsely, "Mama, we're not afraid anymore," her heart tightened. Lydia, ash on her cheek, added firmly, "Not while he's here." Their words, spoken in the quiet aftermath, rang louder than any sermon. Jace, leaning heavily against the fence, looked at them, his throat tight. For years he had carried only the weight of his own wandering, but now the weight was shared, heavier yet steadier, the weight of belonging. It frightened him almost as much as it steadied him, but he did not look away. Sheriff McGraw crouched near the barn, lifting a blackened scrap of cloth from the snow, a torn bandana, singed at the edges, marked with a crude brand burned into the weave. He held it up for the others to see, his jaw set. Blackwood's mark. This wasn't just a warning. He's staking claim. His gaze swept the weary faces. He'll be back, and next time he won't stop with fire. Clara tightened her hold on Samuel and Lydia, her eyes meeting Jace's across the yard. He met her look with calm resolve, his bloodied shirt proof of sacrifice, his eyes carrying the weight of a promise not yet spoken. In that silent exchange, she felt something solid, where before there had been only fear. The barn still smoked, the ground still smoldered, but in the hollow, something stronger than fire had been kindled, a unity that no storm could extinguish. Yet on the far ridge, where dawnlight crept across the snow, the faint silhouette of riders moved before vanishing into the trees. The fight was not finished. It was only beginning. The barn still smelled of smoke, charred timbers black against the pale drifts of spring snow. But in Sagebrush Hollow, the fear that once gripped every heart had begun to loosen. Sheriff McGraw returned from his ride to town with word that Colton Blackwood's power had been broken. Witnesses from across the county stepped forward, emboldened by the fire and by the stand that Clara and her neighbors had made. Ranchers who once kept their heads low now spoke aloud of land stolen and debts rigged, and a traveling judge from Cheyenne, stern and sharp-eyed, had listened long enough to strip Blackwood of his claims. With the law against him and the community refusing to bend, the Baron's empire crumbled like timber under rot. He would not return. When the news spread, relief washed over the valley. Clara felt it in the absence of whispers. When she walked into the mercantile, Lydia noticed it in the way her classmates beckoned her into games she had once watched from the fence, and Samuel in the sound of his own easy laughter, free at last of the shadows that had haunted their nights. Even Jace carried himself differently, the tension that had once marked his every gesture easing, though the scar on his chest remained a reminder of the fight that had brought him here. One evening, with the sky painted in streaks of rose and gold, Clara walked the pasture with Jace. The cattle grazed peacefully, the snow melting into rivulets that shimmered beneath the fading light. Samuel and Lydia played a short distance away, chasing one another through the grass, their voices high and untroubled. Jace stopped near the fence line, where wildflowers had begun to push through the thaw, his hands resting against the worn cedar rail. "I've been many things," he said, his voice low and steady. "A drifter, a ranch hand, a man with nothing but the road before him. I thought that was all I'd ever be, until the night I fell half dead at your door. Since then, I've found something I never thought I'd hold again." He reached into his coat and drew out a small box, carved with morning glory vines etched during long nights of healing. Inside lay a ring of simple silver, polished smooth with age, once belonging to his mother. Clara's throat tightened. For a moment she saw Henry's face, felt again the ache of his absence, the promises that death had stolen. She hesitated, her heart tugged between memory and the man standing before her now, scarred yet strong, steady where once she had known only uncertainty. Before she could speak, Samuel and Lydia came running. Samuel's eyes widened at the glint of silver. "Mama," he whispered, "is he asking?" Lydia looked between them, her gaze sharper, already guessing. "He's asking us too," she said quietly. Jace knelt in the soft earth, his hand steady despite the years of wandering that had left him scarred. "Not just your mother," he told them, his eyes soft but sure. "I'm asking you, both as well, to let me stay, to stand as your family if you'll have me." Samuel's grin spread wide, bright as dawn. "Then you'll never leave us?" "Not unless you send me away," Jace answered. Lydia, once so guarded, studied him for a long moment. She remembered the man who had sworn to protect them, who had stood in the smoke and flame without flinching, who had kept every promise he made. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "You didn't leave. You stayed." So, yes, Clara's tears slipped free, unashamed. She looked at her children, saw their joy, their faith, and felt her own heart loosen. She nodded, laughter breaking through the ache of memory. "Then yes, Jace Callahan. We'll have you." He rose, slipping the ring gently onto her hand. The children cheered, their voices ringing across the pasture, and Jace pulled Clara close, pressing his lips to her brow with a tenderness that spoke more than words. In that moment, the grief of the past and the promise of the future wove together into something whole. The weeks that followed were filled with labor and laughter. With neighbors lending their tools and time, the barn was mended, new beams raised to replace those that had burned. Men brought timber, women brought food and quilts, and children ran messages or gathered flowers to brighten the windowsills. Samuel learned to handle a rope under Jace's patient eye, his small hands growing surer with each knot. Lydia saddled a bay mare with confidence, guiding her in steady circles, while Clara found herself smiling more freely than she had in years, the weight of fear replaced by the strength of shared effort. One morning, as the family stood before the repaired barn, Clara brushed a hand across the fresh wood, her palm catching on the smooth grain. "It needs a name," she said softly. Lydia's eyes brightened, and she pointed to the vines now climbing the fence, delicate blossoms curling toward the sun. "Morning Glory," she said simply. The words fell into place with quiet certainty. Jace's hand found Clara's, his grip firm. "Morning Glory Ranch," he echoed, "a place for new beginnings." Neighbors came to celebrate, bringing bread still warm from ovens, calves for the herd, seeds for the fields. Sheriff McGraw leaned against the fence with a rare smile, tipping his hat toward Clara and Jace. "Looks like this hollow's got its heart back," he said. Mrs. Talbot clasped Clara's hands with tears in her eyes, whispering, "It's good to see hope rooted here again." Even those who once doubted lingered, softened by what they witnessed. At dusk, lanterns lit the yard, their glow mingling with the soft light of stars. Samuel leaned against Clara's side, Lydia rested her head against Jace's arm, and the sound of laughter and song rose into the night. Clara's gaze lifted to the fields, to the flowers blooming pale against the dark, and she felt her heart settle into peace. Later, she walked quietly to the small wooden cross that marked Henry's resting place, the children and Jace waiting a few steps behind. She knelt, laying a sprig of morning glory at its base. "You gave us love that carried me this far," she whispered. "Now we'll carry it forward." Rising, she turned, her hand slipping into Jace's, and together they walked back toward the light. The storm was past, the fire endured, and in its place a new beginning had been forged. Morning Glory Ranch stood as proof that love could grow even from ashes, that a broken family could be made whole, and that hope, once found, could never be taken again. In the end, the story of Clara, her children, and Jace reminds us that even in the darkest storms, God's hand is never far. What seemed like loss and despair was turned into a new beginning, a home reborn and a family restored. It was not by strength alone, but by the quiet miracle of God's love working through courage, kindness, and the unity of people standing together. In our everyday lives, we may face fires, storms, and moments where hope feels lost. Yet, just as Morning Glory Ranch rose from ashes, we too can find renewal when we trust in the Lord's plan. Sometimes His miracles arrive not in grand displays, but in the form of a helping hand, a second chance, or the courage to love again. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe, write Amen in the comments as a prayer of thanks. Do not forget to subscribe so you can join us for more stories of hope, faith, and the quiet miracles that remind us we are never alone. May God bless you and keep you safe, today and always.